The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, sandwiched between a bill for my ridiculously high internet and a promotional offer for a teeth whitening kit. I almost deleted it without opening, figuring it was just another chain letter from some distant relative I barely remembered. But the subject line caught my eye. Family dinner, mark your calendars. My name is Ethan, by the way, 46 years old, still figuring things out, and apparently, still on the family mailing list despite my best efforts to unsubscribe. I sighed, leaning back in my worn-out office chair. My small apartment in Queens overlooked a perpetually busy street, the soundtrack of my life a constant hum of traffic and distant sirens. Family dinners. The very words conjured up a mix of dread and a faint, almost forgotten longing. The last family dinner I attended was my sister Sarah's wedding 5 years ago. It wasn't exactly a warm and fuzzy affair. My parents, bless their hearts, spent most of the evening subtly, and not so subtly, comparing my career in freelance graphic design to Sarah's husband's booming law firm. My older brother, Michael, mostly ignored me, too busy holding court with his golf buddies. I'd ended up nursing a lukewarm beer in a corner, feeling like an extra in a movie I hadn't auditioned for. Still, there was a part of me, a stubborn little ember that refused to be completely extinguished, that hoped things might be different this time. Maybe my parents had finally realized that not everyone is destined to be a corporate titan. Maybe Michael would remember we actually shared a childhood once. Maybe pigs would fly. I clicked on the email. It was from my mother, of course, her usual breezy, slightly guilt-tripping tone evident even in the digital words. She wrote about how much everyone missed me, doubtful. How it had been too long, true, and mostly by my design. And how she and Dad were treating everyone to a special dinner at the Gilded Spoon, a ridiculously fancy restaurant in Manhattan that probably cost more for a bread basket than I made in a day. The occasion? My cousin Jessica's engagement to some guy named Chad. Apparently, Chad was a very successful investment banker, which, in my family's lexicon, translated to finally, someone in the younger generation who isn't a complete disappointment. I rolled my eyes. Jessica and Chad. Perfect for each other, I imagined. Probably spent their weekends discussing stock portfolios and the merits of different private golf clubs. Not exactly my crowd. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday night. I hesitated for a long moment, my finger hovering over the delete button. On one hand, I could spend the evening in my comfortable solitude, catching up on that documentary about the mating rituals of the Patagonian toothfish. On the other hand, there was that tiny, persistent ember. Maybe, just maybe, this could be a chance to reconnect, to show them I wasn't the screw-up they always seemed to think I was. Against my better judgment, I typed out a short reply, "Count me in." Saturday night arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that makes New York City feel like a giant, sweaty sauna. I debated taking the subway, but the thought of arriving at the Gilded Spoon smelling like a week-old gym sock wasn't appealing. So, I splurged on a cab, the meter ticking upwards with alarming speed as we crawled through the Saturday evening traffic. The Gilded Spoon lived up to its name. The entrance was all polished brass and hushed whispers, the kind of place where you felt like you needed a secret handshake just to get past the maitre d'. I smoothed down my slightly too tight blazer, a relic from my brief and ill-fated attempt at a corporate job, and took a deep breath. Here we go. My family was already seated at a large, round table in the center of the dining room, the kind of table that screamed, "We're important." My parents, Sarah and her lawyer husband, Michael and his perfectly coiffed wife, and of course the happy couple Jessica and Chad. They all looked exactly as I expected. Polished, prosperous, and just a little bit judgmental. As I approached the table, a wave of greetings washed over me, mostly perfunctory. My mother gave me a quick hug, her cheek barely brushing mine. My father offered a curt nod. Michael grunted something unintelligible. Sarah gave me a tight, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Jessica, ever the picture of bridal bliss, squealed and gave me a hug that was a little too enthusiastic. "Ethan, so glad you could make it," she chirped, her eyes already flitting back to Chad, who offered me a handshake that was firm but somehow distant. The only one who seemed genuinely happy to see me was my grandmother, Nana Rose, who was perched at the end of the table, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "Ethan, darling, you look wonderful," she exclaimed, reaching out to squeeze my hand. Nana Rose was always my champion. The one person in the family who never seemed to care about my lack of a real job or my less-than-conventional lifestyle. A waiter, impeccably dressed in a crisp white jacket, pulled out a chair for me. It was the one furthest from everyone else, tucked awkwardly between Nana Rose and a large potted fern. Perfect. The conversation flowed around me, a torrent of wedding plans, Chad's latest business triumphs, and Sarah's kids' achievements. I tried to interject a few times, mentioning a recent project I was particularly proud of, but my words seemed to get lost in the general hubbub. It was the same old story. I was the outlier, the one who didn't quite fit the mold. As the appetizers arrived, miniature quiches and delicate-looking shrimp cocktails, Michael leaned back in his chair, a smug look on his face. "So, Ethan," he began, his voice dripping with faux casualness, "still playing with those computer graphics?" A wave of heat rose to my cheeks. "It's called graphic design, Michael," I corrected, trying to keep my tone even. "And yes, I'm doing quite well, actually." Right," he said dismissively, waving his hand in the air. "Well, as long as you're happy, I guess." The implication was clear. My happiness was irrelevant compared to real success. My mother chimed in, her voice laced with concern. "Ethan, dear, have you thought about maybe branching out? Getting something a little more stable?" I took a deep breath, trying to quell the familiar surge of frustration. "Mom, I am stable. I have a steady stream of clients, and I enjoy what I do. But is it enough?" she pressed, her eyes flicking towards Chad, who was regaling Jessica with a story about closing a multi-million-dollar deal. I felt Nana Rose squeeze my hand under the table. Her silent support was a small comfort in the face of my family's relentless disapproval. The main courses arrived, beautifully plated dishes that looked far too fancy for my humble palate. I ordered the salmon, mostly because it was the least intimidating option on the menu. As we ate, the conversation continued in the same vein. More wedding talk, more boasting about Chad's accomplishments, more thinly veiled criticisms of my life choices. I found myself retreating into my own thoughts, picking at my salmon and trying to ignore the knot of resentment tightening in my stomach. Suddenly, Michael cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "So, Ethan," he said, a mischievous glint in his eyes, "I heard you ran into someone from high school recently." My heart sank. "Here it comes." "Oh?" my mother asked, her eyebrows raised in curiosity. "Who was that?" "Yeah, Ethan, spill the beans," Sarah chimed in, a hint of amusement in her voice. I hesitated, not wanting to dredge up old memories. "It was no one important," I mumbled, focusing on my plate. "Oh, come on," Michael persisted. What was his name?" "Oh yeah, Kevin Miller." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Kevin Miller, my high school bully, the guy who made my life a living hell for 4 miserable years. The guy who used to shove me into lockers, steal my lunch money, and call me names that still echoed in my nightmares. "What about him?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Well," Michael said, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin, "I heard he's doing really well for himself these days. Made a killing in some tech startup." A wave of nausea washed over me. Kevin Miller, successful? Felt grotesquely unfair. This was the guy who made me dread going to school every single day. "Really?" I managed to say, my voice trembling slightly. "Yeah," Michael continued, clearly enjoying my discomfort. "Apparently he's loaded. Lives in some fancy penthouse downtown. Drives a sports car. The whole 9 yards." The rest of my family murmured their approval, their eyes gleaming with a strange mixture of envy and satisfaction. Even Jessica and Chad seemed impressed. "You know," Sarah said, her brow furrowed in thought, "I think I saw him at a charity gala last year. Tall guy, kind of intense-looking." "That's him," Michael confirmed. "Used to be a real jerk in school, though. Remember, Ethan?" He turned to me, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "He used to give you a pretty hard time, didn't he? The memories flooded back, the humiliation, the fear, the feeling of utter helplessness. I could feel my face flushing with shame and anger. Yeah, I remember, I said, my voice tight. Well, look at him now, Michael said, shaking his head in mock disbelief. Guess life has a funny way of working out, huh? I didn't say anything. What was there to say? My family, as usual, was completely oblivious to my pain. They were so caught up in their own little world of status and success that they couldn't even imagine the impact their words were having on me. The waiter arrived to clear our plates. As he began to stack the dishes, the maitre d' approached our table, his expression serious. "Excuse me, Mr. Henderson?" he said, addressing my father. My father looked up, surprised. "Yes, there's a gentleman here to see you," the maitre d' said. "He says it's urgent." My father frowned. "Who is it?" He said his name is Kevin Miller. A collective gasp went around the table. My eyes widened in disbelief. Kevin Miller? Here? Now? My mother looked flustered. Kevin Miller? I don't think we know anyone by that name. Michael, however, looked intrigued. Wait a minute, tall guy? Kind of intense looking? The maitre d' nodded. That's him. Michael's eyes darted to me, a look of dawning realization on his face. Ethan, you don't think... I stared at him, my mind racing. What was Kevin Miller doing here? And why was he asking for my father? The maitre d' cleared his throat. He seemed quite insistent, sir. Said he had some important information. My father hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right, send him over. We all watched in stunned silence as a tall, broad-shouldered man with piercing blue eyes approached our table. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, and there was an air of quiet confidence about him that was hard to ignore. As he reached our table, his gaze swept over us, finally landing on me. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Ethan?" he said, his voice deep and resonant. My heart pounded in my chest. "Kevin?" I managed to stammer out. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned to my father. "Mr. Henderson? I apologize for interrupting your dinner, but I have something you need to see." He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. He placed it on the table in front of my father. My father looked at the folder, then back at Kevin, his expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "What is this?" Kevin's gaze shifted back to me, a strange intensity in his eyes. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this is the signed contract for the acquisition of your company. The deal closed this afternoon." A stunned silence descended upon the table. My father stared at the folder, his face slowly turning ashen. My mother gasped. Michael's jaw dropped. Sarah and her husband exchanged bewildered glances. Jessica and Chad looked like they had just witnessed a magic trick. Nana Rose, however, simply smiled, a knowing look in her eyes as she squeezed my hand again. Kevin Miller, my high school bully, had just walked into my family's fancy dinner and dropped a bombshell that would change everything. And I had absolutely no idea what was going to happen next. My father's face was a mask of disbelief. He picked up the folder, his hands trembling slightly, and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the pages, widening with each passing second. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and shaken. This can't be right," he stammered, looking up at Kevin, his voice barely above a whisper. "There must be some mistake." Kevin's expression remained calm, almost detached. "No mistake, Mr. Henderson. The paperwork is all in order. Your lawyers have reviewed everything." My mother reached out a hand, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my father's arm. "What is it, dear? What's happening?" My father didn't answer. He just kept staring at the contract, his eyes darting from one line to the next. Finally, he looked up, his gaze meeting mine for the first time all evening. There was a strange mixture of shock and something else. Fear in his eyes. "Ethan," he said, his voice hoarse, "did you know about this?" All eyes turned to me. I shook my head slowly, my mind still reeling from the unexpected turn of events. No, Dad. I had no idea. Michael leaned forward, his usual smugness replaced by a look of stunned confusion. Wait a minute. Kevin Miller? You bought Dad's company? Kevin nodded. That's correct. But why? Michael sputtered, clearly struggling to process the information. Kevin's gaze shifted to Michael, a hint of steel entering his eyes. Let's just say Mr. Henderson's company offered a unique investment opportunity. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, chimed in. But the price? Dad's been talking about selling for years, but the offers he's been getting. She trailed off, her eyes widening as she seemed to grasp the implications. Jessica and Chad exchanged nervous glances, the glow of their engagement momentarily dimmed by the unfolding drama. Nana Rose simply watched, a faint smile playing on her lips. My father finally found his voice, his tone sharp with disbelief. But I never spoke to you about this, Miller. How did you even know my company was for sale? Kevin's eyes flickered towards me again, a hint of something unreadable in their depths. Let's just say I have my sources, Mr. Henderson. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. My family was clearly in shock, their carefully constructed world of success and superiority suddenly shaken to its core. And I was just sitting there, watching it all unfold, feeling a strange mix of bewilderment and a flicker of something akin to satisfaction. Then, Nana Rose spoke, her voice surprisingly strong and clear. Well, isn't this interesting? Ethan always did have a knack for surprises. Everyone turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Nana Rose just smiled serenely, as if she were enjoying a particularly good play. Kevin cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him. Perhaps we could discuss the details in a more private setting, Mr. Henderson? My father nodded slowly, still looking dazed. Yes, of course. He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on me for a moment. Excuse us, he mumbled, rising from his chair. Kevin nodded politely to the rest of my family and followed my father as the maitre d' led them towards a quieter area of the restaurant. The silence at our table was heavy and uncomfortable. My mother wrung her hands nervously. Michael kept shaking his head in disbelief. Sarah and her husband whispered to each other. Jessica and Chad looked utterly bewildered. Finally, Michael turned to me, his eyes narrowed. Ethan, what the hell is going on? You have something to do with this, don't you? I met his gaze, trying to keep my expression neutral. Michael, I told you, I didn't know anything about this. Bullshit, he spat, his voice rising. You've always been jealous of Dad's success. This is your way of getting back at him, isn't it? You somehow convinced your old bully to buy his company out of spite. That's not true, I said, my voice calm despite the anger bubbling inside me. I haven't spoken to Kevin Miller in over 20 years. Then how do you explain this? Sarah demanded, her voice sharp. He shows up here out of the blue and buys Dad's company? It's too much of a coincidence. I shrugged. Maybe he just saw a good business opportunity. A good business opportunity that somehow involves you? Michael scoffed. I don't buy it for a second. Honestly, Michael, I said, my patience finally wearing thin. Why would I orchestrate something like this? What would I even gain? I don't know, he snapped. Maybe you think you can swoop in and take over the company now that Dad's out of the picture. That's ridiculous, I said, shaking my head in disbelief. I have my own career. I don't need Dad's company. Oh, come on, Ethan, Sarah said, her voice laced with sarcasm. Let's be real. Your little freelance gig isn't exactly bringing in the big bucks, is it? The familiar sting of their judgment hit me hard. Despite all my efforts, they still saw me as the underachiever, the one who would never amount to anything. I was about to retort when Nana Rose spoke again, her voice cutting through the tension. Enough, all of you. Can't you see Ethan is just as surprised by this as we are? Everyone turned to look at her, their faces still etched with suspicion. Honestly, Nana Rose continued, shaking her head, the way you all jump to conclusions, Sometimes I think you enjoy finding fault with Ethan." Her words hung in the air, a rare moment of truth in the midst of our family's carefully constructed facade. For a brief moment, everyone seemed to consider her words, a flicker of doubt crossing their faces. Just then, my father and Kevin Miller returned to the table. My father's face was still pale, but there was a new expression in his eyes, a strange mix of resignation and understanding. He sat down heavily, not meeting anyone's gaze. Kevin remained standing, his presence still radiating an aura of quiet power. "Well," my mother said tentatively, breaking the silence. "What did he want?" My father sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. He made me an offer I couldn't refuse." "What kind of offer?" Michael pressed, his voice still laced with suspicion. My father finally looked up, his gaze settling on me. "He bought the company, Michael. Lock, stock, and barrel." "But why?" Sarah asked again, her voice filled with disbelief. My father hesitated for a moment, then looked at Kevin. Kevin gave a small nod. My father took a deep breath. He said he was doing it for Ethan. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone stared at my father, then at Kevin, then at me, their expressions a mixture of utter shock and complete bewilderment. "For me," I finally managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. "Why would he do that for me?" Kevin finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Mr. Henderson's company, well, let's just say it had some vulnerabilities. It was on the verge of collapse. I stepped in to prevent that from happening." "But why would you care?" Michael demanded. "You haven't seen Ethan in years." Kevin's gaze turned to me, and for the first time, I saw a hint of something other than detachment in his eyes. There was a flicker of regret, and maybe even a touch of sadness. "Because," Kevin said, his voice quiet but firm, "Ethan and we have a history." He paused, then looked directly at my family. "A history that some of you might not be aware of." He took a step closer to the table, his gaze sweeping over each of my family members in turn. "You see, in high school I wasn't exactly a model student. I wasn't very kind to Ethan." A collective gasp went around the table. My family stared at Kevin, then at me, their faces etched with disbelief. I bullied him," Kevin continued, his voice low. "I made his life miserable. And for that, I have always been deeply ashamed." He turned to me, his eyes filled with a sincerity that I hadn't expected. "Ethan, I know an apology isn't enough, not after all these years. But I truly am sorry for the way I treated you." I stared at him, my mind struggling to reconcile the imposing businessman standing before me with the cruel, taunting teenager I remembered. "When I heard about your father's company's troubles," Kevin continued, turning back to my family, "I saw an opportunity to not only make a sound investment but also to try and make amends for my past behavior." He looked at my father. "Mr. Henderson, I assure you, my intentions are purely business. I plan to turn this company around, to make it profitable again. And as part of that plan," he paused, his gaze shifting back to me, "I'd like to offer Ethan a position within the company, a significant position, one where his skills and talents can truly be appreciated." The silence at the table was absolute. My family stared at Kevin, then at me, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning realization of their own behavior towards me. My father finally broke the silence, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "Ethan, is this true? He bullied you in high school?" I nodded slowly, the memories still vivid in my mind. My mother looked horrified. "Oh, Ethan, darling, why didn't you ever tell us?" I shrugged, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. Would it have mattered? The question hung in the air, unanswered. My family knew the truth. They had always dismissed my feelings, always minimized my struggles. And now, the very person who had once made my life a living hell was offering me a lifeline, a chance to finally prove myself. I looked at Kevin, 1,000 questions swirling in my mind. Why was he doing this? Was he truly sincere? Could I ever forgive him for the pain he had caused me? He met my gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "Ethan," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "this is your chance. A chance to show everyone what you're truly capable of." I looked around the table at my family, their faces a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of power, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to change. I took a deep breath and looked back at Kevin. I don't know what to say. He offered a small smile. "Say yes, Ethan. Say yes to a new beginning." I hesitated for a moment longer, the weight of years of feeling like an outsider finally lifting from my shoulders. Then I nodded. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Yes, I'll do it." A collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the table, though I suspected for different reasons for each person. Nana Rose beamed, squeezing my hand again. Kevin extended his hand towards me. I shook it firmly, a sense of cautious optimism blossoming in my chest. "Welcome aboard, Ethan," he said, a genuine smile finally gracing his lips. The rest of the dinner seemed to fade into a blur. My family, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, tried to engage in polite conversation, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The focus was no longer on Jessica's engagement or Chad's accomplishments. It was on me, on my past, and on my unexpected future. As the evening drew to a close, Kevin made his excuses and left, promising to be in touch with me soon to discuss the details of my new role. My father, still looking somewhat dazed, thanked him for the dinner and for the opportunity. As we were leaving the restaurant, my mother pulled me aside, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Ethan, are you sure about this? Working for him?" I nodded. "Mom, this could be a really good thing for me. A chance to finally do something meaningful." She hesitated for a moment, then gave me a hug. "Well, if you think it's the right thing, then I'm happy for you, dear." It didn't sound entirely convincing, but it was better than I had expected. Michael clapped me on the shoulder, a forced smile on his face. "Hey, congrats, little brother. Maybe you'll finally be able to afford a decent place to live." His attempt at humor fell flat, but I let it slide. Sarah offered a more genuine smile. "That's great news, Ethan. I'm really happy for you." Even Jessica and Chad offered their congratulations, albeit with a slightly bewildered air. As I walked out of the Gilded Spoon and into the cool night air, I felt a sense of lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The years of being underestimated, of feeling like the black sheep of the family, seemed to have finally reached a turning point. I still had a lot of questions for Kevin. Why had he really done this? Was he truly trying to make amends? Or was there something else going on? But for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope. Maybe this was the new beginning I needed. Maybe my family would finally see me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. As I hailed a cab, I glanced back at the restaurant, the warm glow spilling out onto the street. My family was still inside, undoubtedly dissecting the evening's events. But I was no longer the awkward outsider looking in. I was on a new path, a path that had been paved by the most unlikely of people, my former bully. And for the first time, I was excited to see where it would lead.